In one of his books of short stories, Robert Fulghum wrote about John Pierrepoint, who in 1866 died and was considered a great failure. He died when he was 81 years old. And at first, his future looked so bright. He graduated from Yale and was committed to pursuing a career in education, but he failed as a teacher because he was just too lenient with the students. And so he decided to try law, but he failed as a lawyer because he kept taking cases to try for justice for the underdog, but none of these underdogs could actually pay him his fee. So he decided to try being a businessman, but he failed as a businessman because he never charged enough and he was far too generous in offering credit. And so then he decided he'd try to make a living with his hobby, which was poetry. And he did succeed at publishing a couple of volumes of poetry, but he never earned enough royalties to actually earn a living. So then he decided to try ministry, but he failed at ministry because it's a really hard job. He failed at ministry because he was so outspoken for prohibition and against slavery, and that upset some prominent people in his church, and so he was asked to resign. So then he decided to try politics because he could pursue promoting these viewpoints that he had, but he could never win an election. And so then he decided he would try being a chaplain. It was during the Civil War, and he thought he'd be a chaplain, and he lasted 2 whole weeks. So he failed once more. His final job was as a mail clerk in the Treasury Department. He did have one other success, however. One wintry, snowy afternoon, he wrote a song called Jingle Bells. But not exactly a stellar professional career. His professional career could be seen from the perspective as a complete and utter failure. But yet from another angle, another perspective, Pierrepoint could be seen as a great success because no matter what job he had, no matter what career he happened to be pursuing at the time, he always expressed care, compassion, and concern for other people. He fought against slavery. He persevered in the struggle for social justice. As a good and faithful person, Pierrepoint was a great success. And that places him in stark contrast with the central figure of our scripture lesson this morning, Zacchaeus. In his career as a tax collector, Zacchaeus was a great success. No one could surpass him. But as a good and faithful person, he was pretty much a failure, one of the world's greatest failures. He was wealthy, he was rich, he was really good at his job of collecting taxes, but he was despised and he was alone. Because it simply cannot be overstated. The system of taxation at that time was immoral, it was corrupt, and it was oppressive. If you remember at that time, Israel was part of an occupied territory. It was occupied land by Rome. And Rome hired local people in order to collect taxes for them. And Rome would set a specific amount of money that was to be collected for any city or district. And as long as Rome received its set amount, could care less if somebody decided to charge a little bit extra in order to pad his own pocket. And so, as occupied people, the people of Israel were incredibly poor. Most Jews were eking out a subsistence level existence, barely able to feed their families, barely able to feed themselves. They were so poor, and yet then they were burdened with so many taxes imposed by Rome. There was a poll tax that was just for existing. There was an income tax, a ground tax, and then there were all of these duties that you had to pay. So you had to pay a duty or a tax in order to use a road, in order to enter a market, in order to use a harbor. And if you were on the road with your cart, you could be charged a duty for your cart, for every wheel that was on your cart. So for all 4 wheels, you could be charged a duty for the animal that was pulling your cart. And if a tax collector was in the mood, he could stop you, force you to take all of your bundles out of your cart, look at what you had, and then decide to impose a tax upon all of that. Jericho, where Zacchaeus was a really busy trade center. So clearly Zacchaeus had the opportunity to collect an awful lot of taxes, and he was so wealthy, it's obvious he abused his power, robbing from his very own people for personal gain. So tax collectors were despised because they were hired by the enemy, by Rome, and they were despised because they cheated their own people, made the poor even be poorer, simply in order to pad their own income, in order to become even wealthier than they already were. And so it's just not at all surprising that Zacchaeus was alone and despised because he was wealthy and had clearly cheated so many people. So it's also not a surprise that one day when Jesus was walking through Jericho and word came that this controversial rabbi who also did these miraculous healings and the crowded streets of Jericho became even busier, it's not surprising that no one was really interested in helping Zacchaeus get a better view. He was short. He couldn't see what was going on, but no one wanted to help him. And so he took his own journey. We're still on Journey On here. So he took his own journey and did what he always did, took care of himself. He climbed up a tree. But then, as Jesus was walking by, he looked up that tree and he saw Zacchaeus, and he called Zacchaeus by his name. And he said, Zacchaeus, you and I need to spend some time together today. So Zacchaeus came down out of that tree, and Jesus and Zacchaeus walked off together. Can you imagine what that felt to the good and faithful people of Jericho? I mean, why was Zacchaeus getting all of the attention? Why was Jesus showing him such great favor? Unfortunately, Luke doesn't tell us the details of the conversation between Zacchaeus and Jesus. But what we do know is that after those two people spent time together, Zacchaeus emerged a changed person. Somehow, in that time that they spent together, Jesus was able to transform Zacchaeus's understanding of himself, how he saw himself, and how he saw other people. In that conversation, Jesus was able to transform Zacchaeus's perception of himself and of others. It was incredible because what Jesus offered to Zacchaeus was the understanding that he was still part of the family. He was still part of the family of God. He was still a son of Abraham. He was still a beloved and chosen child of God. Can you imagine that? I mean, here's this man who had cheated so many people, who no longer acted with a conscience, and yet Jesus was welcoming him back and saying, you're still part of the family of God. You are still a beloved child of God, no matter what you've done. It's sort of interesting to ponder how Zacchaeus got into the position he did. How did he become so lost? How did he become so estranged from the people and their values? There's a story about a city dweller that was walking on a country road, and this urbanite came across a farmer and asked the farmer what he was doing, and the farmer said he was looking for lost sheep. And the city dwellers said, well, how did the sheep get lost? They're in this fenced-in pasture. And the farmer said, they nibble themselves lost. What sheep do is they look down most of the time, looking at tufts of grass, and they just sort of keep nibbling from one tuft of grass to the next tuft of grass, and they might slip through a hole in a fence and not realize that they've moved through the hole in the fence, and at some point they look up and realize they're lost and they have no idea how to get back. I sort of wonder if that has something to say about what happened to Zacchaeus. He nibbled himself lost. He was being a good tax collector and then thought, maybe I'll just try overcharging a little bit. And that felt kind of good, so he kept overcharging and overcharging until he got completely lost and self-centered and enjoying the wealth. But Jesus was able to bring Zacchaeus back to himself, back to a sense of conscience, back to being committed to God's people, because he told him, you are a beloved child of God, part of this community. This week I watched a video of a young man, probably in his 20s, named Landry Jones. And Landry Jones was talking about how as a high schooler, he just loved high school because he was a star football player. He started every game, he was popular, he had great grades, he just loved being in high school. And so he was recruited by a number of Division I coaches to play football at their schools. So he went to the University of Oklahoma. But when he got there, he discovered there were a lot of other really good football players, and he ended up just warming the bench, never saw any minutes on the field. And it was devastating to him. He started to party, whereas before he had always taken good care of his body. He raced through relationships with women, and his grades started to sink. And then in this video, this young man, Landry, he just talks about how there was just this moment in his life when he felt the Spirit of God descending upon him, and he could just feel God's presence with him. And the message was, Landry, you may not ever be a good football player, a star football player again, but you will always be my beloved child. You will always be my chosen beloved child. And it changed this young man. And he could accept that he might not be a football player and that there would be some other kind of potential for him. That's what God can do for us. In those times when we might feel a little lost from our true sense of self, we lose our direction or our purpose, God can bring us back and remind us that no matter what else, we are always a beloved child of God, full of potential. On that day for Zacchaeus, in his interaction with Jesus, he had his perception changed of himself, and he recognized he could still be part of the community, he could still be a beloved child of God, and it changed how he understood himself, and it changed how he saw other people. He now could have compassion and care and concern for other people and treat them justly. He emerged saying he was going to give back all of the money and even more that he had stolen from people, and he would give of his wealth to the poor, give it away. It was as if Zacchaeus emerged and decided he wanted to start to act like Jesus acted, live like Jesus lived, to look as much like Jesus as he possibly could. In a sermon on Zacchaeus, Reverend William Wilson told a story about a family. The parents decided they were called to be missionaries in India, and they left behind a 12-year-old son and another son a little bit younger. And their plan was to go over to India and get all things set up and settled, and then they would have their children come and join them. The problem was after they got to India, World War II broke out. And so for 8 years, the parents could not return to America, and the boys could not sail and join their parents in India. But after those 8 years, and the parents were returning, the older son, who was now 20, was meeting his parents at the train station in their hometown. And he remembered the anxiety he felt. What was it going to be like to see his parents again? The train was arriving before dawn, so it was a hazy darkness as the train pulled in. train came in and it was only his parents that disembarked. And they had a touching reunion as they all hugged in this darkness. But then his mother took his hand and took him to the train station, saying she wanted to look at his face in the light. And when she saw his face in the light, she said to her husband, "Look, Arnett, he's come and he looks like you. He looks just like you." That's, I think, what Zacchaeus wanted people to see. They wanted to be able to look at him and say, "Look, he looks like Jesus now. I see God in him. When he acts, I see Jesus' act." Is there any better perspective? Is there any more wonderful compliment than to think that someone might look at you and how you live your life and say, "You know what? I see God in you. The way you are behaving towards others, I see Jesus in you. I see Jesus reflected in you." So as a beloved child of God, owning that in his heart, Zacchaeus then was able to show love, show compassion, show care for others. That's clearly what we're called to do. On Thursday night, a number of us were gathered in the temple here in Beverly. It was a community discussion about the graffiti that had appeared on the wall of the temple, the money sign and the Merry Christmas message. And as the community discussed this act of hate, there was a great deal of talk about how in this day and age and what's going on in politics in our country right now, it's becoming more and more okay to use hate speech, exclusive speech that says there are people out there and then there's other people, and how we really need to offer welcome. We need to really think about inclusion. And what better example of that was this than this interaction between Jesus and Zacchaeus? You cannot move beyond God's love and care, beyond God's reach. You are always a beloved child of God. Knowing that, then maybe we can act like Jesus. Jesus will be seen in how we live our lives. So what's your perspective of success and failure today?